Thank you. Hi, everyone. Well, I'm excited to talk about questionnaire design. Some of this information I hope sounds a little elementary to you, meaning you've thought that you like the idea of an open-ended question or a closed-ended question. I'm still going to go into that just a little bit throughout, but I'm also hopefully going to introduce some new ideas to you. I also will preface this with there is so much to questionnaire design. There are full books dedicated to just this topic alone, and I'll provide those to you at the end. So I'm going to I feel like I'm giving you basically the tip of the iceberg because there's a lot of things there's just not time to cover. But I think this will get your mind working on it, get you thinking about it, and then also I'll point you to those resources because there's books, like I said, dedicated just to this topic on using questionnaires in language and linguistics research. So this presentation today is kind of framed based on using it in our discipline, and obviously it's a tool that's used in other disciplines. So first I want to clarify some terminology. So researchers, they're going to use a lot of terms for data collection tools. So survey, inventory, questionnaire, right? Checklist. And when I say questionnaire, your mind might immediately jump to thinking about surveys. And that's completely understandable because a questionnaire is a tool, right? It's a set of questions you give participants. And in everyday language, people often use the word survey and the word questionnaire kind of interchangeably. Like, can you complete this questionnaire? Can you complete the survey? So, in that sense, a survey is thought of like a questionnaire, right, as a tool. So, but the term survey also has kind of a broader meaning in research. It refers to survey research, which is a study design, not just a set of questions. So, it's important not to confuse the questionnaire itself with a survey research design. So, like an example, like a questionnaire being a tool, this is a set of questions that you've created. And for example, you might ask students about their language learning habits with these questions, and you're just using this as an instrument that to get to those answers, right? But you can use the tool, this instrument, in different ways. Survey research design, on the other hand, is this is the study that you plan, like sending that questionnaire to 500 students, like to find some generalizable findings about maybe the whole school's language learning habits, right? But that same questionnaire, that same tool could be used in like a qualitative case study where maybe you only interview 10 students to get like a really in-depth experience. So the tool stays the same, but the design and purpose are different, right? So today we're really focusing on the tool itself, but knowing the terminology differences can be useful because sometimes when you're reading between like multiple books and articles, even inside our discipline, but especially cross disciplines, they may use the term survey like in a different way than we're conceptualizing it as a tool. So why use questionnaires? Obviously, these are useful for capturing information about individuals and their experiences with language use, language learning, language teaching. You can gather facts about participants, like their behaviors and their beliefs, their attitudes and their values. So we can use questionnaires to kind of get an overall picture of how language is used, how it's experienced, how it's perceived, and also get background information about the people that we're studying, right? It's also in itself as a tool a very efficient way to collect lots of information from lots of participants. It's especially useful if the group like or the participant group that you're wanting to study is not a group that you are physically in proximity with, or also if the group you're studying is pretty dispersed globally, or they're maybe not like in a regional population, right? So this tool becomes beneficial to us in those situations. We also get to use these to help collect maybe discrete or sensitive information, and we'll touch on that again a little later on. They're also very low cost to no cost. And I say low cost because if you're going to distribute it on something like Mechanical Turk, which I don't know if I thought to mention later or not, but it's a platform where you can find participants to complete your survey. That's obviously going to cost a little money, but in general, distributing a survey is no cost. And primarily, one of the things about this tool is that it's less time consuming than conducting things like interviews or observations. Um, Questionnaires also can be used to help you identify participants who meet like a study's criteria. So like taking like a large group and narrowing it down to specific people that you actually want to study in depth. So, for example, like a questionnaire that like is focusing on multilingual school children, it can ask a question like which languages do you speak, and it allows you, the researchers, to select those who fit the focus for follow-up interviews or observations. So let's imagine that school population, you don't even know who the multilinguals are. Well, we can use a survey first to identify those, and in this way the questionnaire kind of serves as a first step to data collection, kind of helping you narrow down what you want to study further. So they can be used alone as the main tool, or they can be used maybe more as a mixed methods approach alongside other things like interviews. The important thing to remember is that the questionnaire is just a research tool. It's a way to collect data. Its use really depends on like broader methodological choices that you need to make as a researcher. So first, considering your research questions, what do you want to determine? Well, I guess what you want to know determines like whether a questionnaire is really appropriate for your studies. So if you're interested in like subjective opinions or attitudes or self-reported behaviors, questionnaires can work really well for this. If you want to study maybe natural interactions or unconscious behaviors, other methods like observing or recording people, that may be better for what you're doing. Something else to consider is your overall research design. So questionnaires fit very differently in quantitative and qualitative and mixed method studies. In a quantitative study, they're great because they can provide like large scale comparable data, right? In a mixed method study, a questionnaire might serve like as a first step to screening participants, like I said on the last slide. And we'll talk about quantitative and qualitative research, that distinction with questionnaires in a second. But finally, you also have to consider your data analysis plan. So the type of analysis you plan to use, so statistical testing, thematic coding, correlational studies, all of this affects how you design your questionnaire items or whether or not you're even going to use a questionnaire. And we'll talk about designing those items too. So those closed-ended questions versus those open-ended questions, what kind of data are we trying to get at? So the reality is that using a questionnaire, though, needs to align with these methodology choices, right? We can't just jump to the tool without having figured out whether or not it's the right tool for what we're wanting to do. The question of, are questionnaires for qualitative or quantitative research? And traditionally, questionnaires are associated with quantitative research, using numbers and closed-ended questions. In this light, they're especially useful for gathering like standardized information from large groups of people. And for this reason, like most of the scholarship you look at, and especially in linguistics from like 7 or more years ago, they're going to primarily emphasize using questionnaires in this way, in a quantitative way. More modern perspectives, though, however, recognize that questionnaires can also be used to collect qualitative data through open-ended items. So there is some limitation that way, which scholars note, and primarily the argument, in prior years why it's not a great method for qualitative research is that participants may provide like short surface level responses. Questionnaires lack flexibility compared to like a face-to-face interaction, right? So they're very structured, and we'll talk about that again in a second. But if researchers really want long, detailed personal accounts, unstructured or semi-structured face-to-face interviews of some type are generally better. That said, structured interviews, so face-to-face interviews that are highly structured, right, where all participants are asked the exact same questions, those maybe aren't usually ideal for like rich qualitative data. But if you think about it, a structured face-to-face interview where all the participants are getting the same questions is exactly what a questionnaire is also offering, right? So if the goal is consistency amongst all your participants, a questionnaire can also provide that, in place of the time-consuming interview process. Qualitative research questionnaires kind of resembled structured interviews because they follow that script. And they also can include prompts like, hey, please elaborate on your previous response, right? Which makes it similar to that like semi-structured face-to-face interview. Terminology note, the term qualitative research questionnaire in a 2023 publication, which I'll provide a link to at the end, emphasizes that that's the term we're now using for, instead of just saying questionnaire, which I think highly implies it's more quantitative, the new term, I guess, is qualitative research questionnaire, which emphasizes that the tool is being used as qualitative, or like mixed methods with the qualitative and quantitative. So these questionnaires offer practical advantages. You obviously can reach populations that are spread out or difficult to access, especially like if you're using technology, which we'll emphasize here in a second. Depending on your research topic, questionnaires are a way to gather, information on sensitive topics. Questionnaires can be completed anonymously, and sometimes they actually result in more honest responses. So these things considered, using them for qualitative analysis, it provides its own benefits for collecting qualitative data. They may be best used, though, alongside interviews and observations if your goal is like a really in-depth understanding. And we'll talk about some how they sabotage the research experience, these questionnaires, a little later on. So you might just have to keep that in mind, that it's a supporting tool to something else you're doing to get more of these richer accounts. When you think about how to administer your questionnaire, so we will talk about designing questions in a second, but I also think it's important to consider how you're going to get the questionnaire to participants, because the way you choose to administer it might influence the content and the format of your questions. So for example, if your participants are like working professionals who are going to be completing this questionnaire on their phone, you're probably going to want shorter, clear questions with easy select answers. Or if the questionnaire has sensitive topics, you're obviously going to want an anonymous online questionnaire to get more of that honest response than what you're going to get in a face-to-face questionnaire. So we want to think about how it's getting to our participants in some ways concurrently with the designing aspect of the survey and thinking through the questions that you want in it. So now, generally, when we talk about administering, I think I'm using that word wrong. Maybe not. Sometimes words come out of my mouth. And I'm like, is that the word I want? You know what I'm talking about, though. They're basically administering the questionnaire basically falls into two broad classifications. You have self-administered, which are completed in writing. And by writing, I mean like, pen and paper, or even like on a computer, right? So with tech enhancement. And these can be completed individually or by groups and can be returned immediately. They're really, really convenient. They require less effort from the researcher. And to emphasize it again, it allows the participants to answer sensitive questions anonymously, right? It may not, these self-administered assessments and giving it out this way may not work well for participants with literacy challenges. And we'll touch again on that a little bit in a minute. And you also have less control over who actually completes them. So high response rates are usually achieved when participants complete them on site. And so that's something to consider, how you can still do a self-administration, but on site. But there's also this idea of interviewer administered questionnaires. These are typically delivered verbally. This can be face-to-face or by phone, maybe even it's on Zoom. And they still, even though it's done verbally, it's still a very standardized delivery. It's just as if they were receiving it in a written form and taking it themselves, right? We still want to be really consistent with the delivery of those questions. And an advantage of this, though, is that an interviewer, so you, the researcher, are there asking the question to the participant, is that you can clarify questions. So helping them give you then an accurate response. And again, this comes back to some of the literacy and language challenges that I'll talk about in a second. Something else we have to consider is kind of this mix of, do you want to do online and electronic questionnaires, or do you want to do the traditional pen and paper? I don't even know if you can call pen and paper traditional anymore, because to me, traditional now is online. So there's choices to make too. I imagine that most of you will do online or electronic questionnaires, because the data is then already, transcribed for you. You're not having to type up what you collected in those paper questionnaires. So benefit of something that's online is it really can be completed anytime, especially when it's that self-administered questionnaire. So it's flexible, it's convenient. And the online questionnaires obviously are going to support that anonymity, if that's something that you need to provide to your participant pool, right? Something you have to think about, which I'm not spending a lot of time on in this moment, but if you are doing something online, you have to think about it being mobile friendly, because that's probably a good way many people are going to be taking your survey, considering it's the device that's most likely in front of them. Um, Now, obviously, something that's online may run the risk of excluding participants who lack certain literacy skills or certain language skills and don't have access to technology or the internet. So these are just things to keep in mind depending on the population you're trying to study, right? Because depending on the population, those factors could play a big role in their access to being in this study. Um, Now there are several modes. I don't guess I'm not going to go into all of these in terms of how you could administer these. These can be one-to-one in person, one-to-one synchronous online, one-to-one asynchronous online, groups in person, groups synchronous online, groups asynchronous online. But all those things have been detailed out to you, especially in the books I'm going to suggest at the end. Um, so when you're planning your questionnaire, you got to balance that reach, you got to balance control, and you also have to balance convenience. And thinking about, how you're going to administer it, I think is going to be like help you guide designing the actual questions for your research. So let's talk about designing questions. So when you the way you ask questions is obviously going to directly affect the quality of the data you collect. So there's basically two types of questions in a traditional questionnaire. The first would be those demographic questions, so collecting age, gender, occupation, education, number of languages spoken, and those usually are things like multiple choice or check boxes. And we'll look at this closer. We'll look at some of those ways you form questions in a second. And then you've got your main topic-based content questions. So this is where you're asking participants about their experiences or their perceptions or their practices. Um, just so you know, a common strategy is usually to start with closed-ended questions and then follow up with those open-ended questions. So speaking of closed and open-ended questions, essential, these are really essential for, quantitative studies. And open-ended questions are really obviously great and needed for those qualitative studies. And we'll spend the next couple slides looking at those in a little more detail. Um, Now, there's three types of question formats. You've got your interrogative sentences. So like, what kind of school did you attend as a child? Requesting factual information. You've got your directives, something like indicate the three radio podcasts that, indicate the three podcasts that you listen to. And then you have declaratives, which are, and these words should sound familiar to you with your speech act studies, right? So declaratives, speaking English helps people get a better job. And then respondents indicate like agree or, disagree or their beliefs and attitudes that way. I mean, this sounds like elementary stuff, of course, but the thing I want to emphasize that you'll also pull from the literature is that you really want to vary up the formatting of what type of formats you're using, because it's going to make it less monotonous and it's also going to make it more engagement and it's going to increase the retention of people completing your survey. Let's circle back, circle into closed-ended questions. So if you aren't familiar with these are questions with predefined answer options. So designed for structured, comparable data, good, again, really good for quantitative research. You can have multiple choice questions like which language do you speak most often? And then you have the set answers below that they can choose from. You have true and false questions, uh, Likert scale questions, drop down selections, and ranking questions. And the thing is, with all of these, is you're giving them their response options. They're not necessarily able to select something that you haven't given them. Things to consider when you're doing closed-ended questions are especially when it's multiple choice, because you're all familiar with that format. Can the participant select only one answer, or am I going to allow the selection of multiple answers? Because that's going to change, obviously, right, the type of data that you're collecting. And also decide if you want a fill in the blank response for like that to give that flexibility or allow them to clarify the answer they've chosen. So with that in mind, another thing you have to consider is that your answer options need to reflect the reality, the experiences, and the choices that are really available to your participants. So if these options don't match their reality, their responses are going to be forced. Your data might not be valid, right? So, for example, if you're asking bilingual speakers whether they would use language A or language B in a particular situation, you can't assume that participants will only use one language. Some participants might naturally use a mixture of both, right? Others might say, no, I use a different language completely in these scenarios. So, on the left would be a multiple choice, closed-ended question that doesn't really reflect reality. On the right, you have a better option for the participants. And notice this particular question style has the fill in the blank. Oh, please specify what else is it that you're using. Open-ended questions, these allow participants to respond in their own words, giving you much more detail, like richer accounts. So things like describe a situation where you felt anxious speaking in a second language, or what strategies do you use to practice your language skills? And these can be typed or audio recorded, which I'll touch on again in a second. And there's several types of open-ended questions you're going to pull from linguistic studies. There's specific open questions, and these ask for factual details. There's clarification questions, like the follow-up prompts. So maybe you have like a closed-ended question above. What's your favorite language to use at home? And then you have the follow-up open-ended question, like, please explain your answer. Maybe you want to use a sentence completion question. So respondents finish an incomplete sentence. Short answer questions where maybe the only response you're expecting is like a short phrase or short sentence. And then there's this idea of specific open questions and broad open questions. So specific open questions require very precise information. So which languages do you speak at home on a daily basis, right? Or broad open questions, they kind of invite like more of an elaborative, reflective response. So how has being a bilingual influenced your daily life or interactions with others? And this type of question is what becomes really valuable to qualitative research. Obviously, any open question is going to capture things that a fixed choice answer, like a closed-ended question, cannot. What your exact questions are really going to depend on the nature and goals of your research. So you need to be clear about what you want to find out so that every question contributes meaningfully to that study. Another important thing to consider is how long the questionnaire will take to complete. So research suggests that questionnaires should take no more than 30 minutes. Longer surveys are going to lead to participant fatigue, which is obviously going to increase the risk of like incomplete responses. Maybe they're skipping some of the questions you're asking them, or they're just going to fully abandon the survey. And if the questionnaire is too long, you may find yourself needing to actually compensate participants, maybe financially or with food, beverage, whatever. That's stuff that you'll have to work into your IRB. If it's very long, you're going to have to justify that to an IRB board or the IRB, right? So this is especially, the length of the survey is especially important when thinking about the self-administered online surveys, because the dropout rates are really high for those. So you need to be strategic with the number and the type of questions that you're asking. You need to focus on the ones that directly address your research questions, and doing your best doing so will help keep it like pretty more concise, right, and more engaging. Other things you need to consider. Obviously, language and translation. So first, we talked about this word literacy. You need to consider the literacy level of your participants. Your questions may need to be short, clear, and easy to understand. So instead of something like, please indicate the frequency with which you engage in multilingual code switching behaviors. You might want to say something like, how often do you switch between languages when talking to friends? Maybe that's not even a great question, but it's already an improvement for where it started. On that note, though, you also need to translate your questionnaire into the appropriate language of your target participant group, right? And that could be language or even the right dialect that the participants actually use. You want to avoid that outsider language or like technical terminology, kind of like in the previous example with the word code switching. That's, technical terms we know, but obviously the general population doesn't have the same definition for that or a working definition for that we do. Um, be aware, we're in language studies, right? So be aware of local ways of referring to language varieties. I couldn't come up with a good example for this, but like if participants call their variety Gaelic, right, don't label it as Scottish Gaelic in your survey. Use the term they're going to actually use. And one strategy to kind of help with all the language and translation items you need to be aware of is to pilot your questions first. And we'll talk about piloting again at the end. But this is going to help you discover the terminology, the categories, or the way we need to ask these questions so it makes sense to our participants. Um, with question construction, when you are not present, right? So let's say it's self-administered questionnaire. You are not, and you're not there as the researcher. You cannot clarify any questions the person might have, right? So because of that, you really need to ensure you have very, very clear wording. So if you say something like, do you experience anxiety during linguistic performance in formal settings or something like that, right? Your participant might go, well, what is performance? What are linguistic or what are formal settings? So you need to think of a way I can ask that same question to get to what it is that I want as the researcher, but with a question and using words that make sense to the participants. So maybe like, do you feel nervous speaking a second language at school or work, right? And maybe that's still not a great question, but we're on a better track from where we were. You also need to avoid assumptions about participants' thoughts, about their understandings of terms, about their feelings. So instead of asking things like, how often do you practice advanced grammar? This assumes, again, that the participant knows what advanced grammar is. So you might need to ask something like, how often do you practice writing or speaking in ways that you find challenging? Something of that. But we have to be aware of the terms we're using and the assumptions we're putting into the questions. Other common pitfalls to avoid: really long and complex questions. Um, something like, how often do you interact with speakers of other languages, and in which contexts do these interactions occur? Well, those are two questions in one, right? So that's something you would want to break down into two separate questions, and then consider, do I really need both of them? Again, it depends on what your research objectives are. So to that point, you don't want irrelevant questions. Don't ask about their reading habits if what you're focusing on is spoken language use, right? If reading has nothing to do with your study, might be interesting, maybe you're curious, but maybe your questionnaire is already at 30 minutes. So these are things we need to cut. You've got negative or double-barreled questions. Let's see, something like, do you not enjoy speaking English and prefer your native language, right? Something that's really hard to follow and understand. Obviously, you don't want leading or biased questions, things like, most people think English is the best language. Do you agree? And then obviously, finally, with our questions, how we're going to ask them, we have to be really sensitive in how we're going to ask questions that might be embarrassing or sensitive. This doesn't mean not to do it, because questionnaires are a great place for that. It's just something you have to be really considerate of, especially depending on what the sensitive topic is that you're investigating. Making sure you're using the politically correct terms, right? So if I'm doing research in accessibility, are we still saying ADHD, or are we calling it something else? Are we still saying neurodivergent, or are we calling it something else? Because different words have different stigmas, right? So be in the know. When assembling your questionnaire, it's important to organize your questions carefully and thoughtfully. We obviously want to group related topics together and separate. And then in addition to that, as I mentioned earlier, you want to separate your main research questions from your demographic questions. And you're just thinking about consistency. If you've ever taken a questionnaire of any type, it's generally the same stylization, right? We've got our demographic questions at top, and then you're expecting more of the research-based questions to follow. If you keep your questionnaire concise, it's going to prevent that participant fatigue, and it's going to help prevent some of those abandonment issues, those incomplete responses. So well-structured, what does that mean? Obviously, you're going to have your title of your survey, your instructions, your demographic questions, then your main questions. I see it's reversed on my slide. Perhaps then ending with final open-ended questions. Now, the order of your main questions might change depending if you're just using it for quantitative data, qualitative data, or mixed. Obviously, it's going to change how the main questions fall throughout the survey. Also, the research shows, though, that a thank you message at the end is like useful. I don't know how, because if they got to the thank you page, they already finished it, but include a thank you message. Thank you for your time. And then a contact or follow up if that's something that's needed for your study, which will be actually in your questionnaire at the beginning. So there are ethical and legal considerations that you have to take in mind with a questionnaire. Participants need to receive very clear information about the study, what the data is going to be used for, confidentiality, what they need to, who they need to be eligible for the study. And so you are also going to embed your informed consent at the top of your questionnaire. So if this is a face-to-face questionnaire that you're administering, um, then obviously that's printed and it's the first couple pages. If it's something that you have online, when a person enters your questionnaire, the first thing they're going to see is the title, and then they're going to see maybe some brief instructions. And in those instructions, it's going to say the first thing you're going to see is a consent form. And then they're going to get that consent form. And that's something that you're going to have already created when you've prepared this for IRB, right? What's really nice about the question, if you're interviewing someone, obviously you're going to have them sign the consent form. What's nice about an online questionnaire, for example, is they don't actually need to sign anything. What you'll do is at the bottom of the consent form on that first page, or however you have your survey set up, maybe it's not pages, maybe it's one single scroll down, but at the bottom of the consent form, you'll say something like, by proceeding in this study, you are consenting to be, for your data to be used, or something of that nature. So you're not collecting signatures, you're just letting them know, if you continue with this questionnaire, that's your consent, which is nice because it still keeps that, this still gives the participant the ability to be fully anonymous, even to you as the researcher, if that's something you're aiming for. What else do we want to talk about? Piloting. All right. Before you ever use your questionnaire, you need to pilot your questionnaire, and you will probably pilot it multiple times. Let me put this in perspective for you with that. If you obviously, maybe with a round or two of piloting, you're giving it to just anybody. So let's say you're actually focusing on Korean students at East Texas A&M University. In your initial pilot stages, you can give your survey to your peers in the lab, to faculty, right, just to see what we think, and we can test out the questionnaire that you have. And that maybe will help you refine some of the things that are in there. But obviously in your piloting, you're going to want to also pilot it with some of the population you're intending to study. So keeping in mind that, again, we're surveying Korean students at East Texas A&M University, I'm going to need to use some of them to pilot my questionnaire, which means then that I'm not going to use them again for my actual study, right? They're not those individuals, I'm not going to call back to complete the survey a second time, right? Because then they're already primed with the information you're trying to research, right? So it's going to lead to some issues. So I just want to put that in your head, but piloting is a must. You're going to need to probably do it multiple times. You're going to test for things like clarity and understanding. Are participants interpreting the questions as you intended them? Were your instructions clear? Another thing that piloting does is allows you to check the length of it, because remember, in your informed consent, you're giving instructions and details on, hey, you're going to complete this questionnaire. It's going to ask these type of questions. It's probably going to take 20 minutes. And the way you get that information for your consent form is through your piloting process, right? This will give you a chance to look at question flow and question structure. If you're doing an online survey, it'll help you identify any technical issues. Maybe you want to find, based on the responses you're getting from the pilot, that you're not getting the responses that you really thought you would get with that question. So you might want to reword some of your questions. And then also you may have to adjust again terminology for accessibility purposes so that it's at the literacy level or the language level of the target population that you're trying to work with, and also that it's accessible on the devices you think they're going to take it on, right? Let's even go back to paper and pen for a minute. If you're piloting something on paper and pen, by the way, that means then you're also intending to actually run it as paper and pen, right? Pilot the survey the way you intend to actually run the survey. But let's say you are doing paper and pen and you're going old school. One of the issues you might run into is you didn't give enough space for the participants to write between each question, right? So all these things will come up when you pilot. Another thing I want to add though is that if you're piloting your survey, your questionnaire, and you are not going to use that data, you're simply piloting it only to strengthen the tool, the questionnaire, to use later in your official research, then you do not need IRB approval. If even the pilot, if you are going to pilot the data, and you still want to use those responses, then that needs IRB approval before you can do that. And colleagues, I believe that's still accurate information. It was 2 years ago, at least. Does that sound right? Someone will let me know. Do. Okay, this one, let's see. I can talk in big, broad strokes about this. I've only done validity and reliability testing in one way, and that was with personality instrument I'm working on and still working on. But one thing, so I'm going to highlight this, but I will say there's a whole chapter in one of the books I'm going to suggest that talks about not only the concepts of validity and reliability, but also how to kind of do that. So this is a very big essential thing that you're doing to make sure that the data that you're collecting is actually trustworthy and it's actually meaningful and it actually represents the truth of whatever phenomena you're trying to study. So validity and reliability. Validity refers to whether your questionnaire actually measures what it's intending to measure. So if, for example, if you design a questionnaire that wants to assess language anxiety, validity then asks, are these questions really capturing language anxiety or something else like general stress, right? Or social anxiety? Those are different issues. Those are different phenomena. So are my questions really focused on language anxiety? And there's several ways to think about validity in questionnaires. So there's content validity, ensuring the questions cover the full range of the concept. So again, with language anxiety, that might include, the concept might include speaking, listening, and reading situations, right? There's construct validity, which shows that the questionnaire truly reflects the theoretical concept. And then there's face validity, which is a simple check. Do the questions appear reasonable and relevant to the participants, to the experts? Reliability, on the other hand, is about consistency. So a reliable questionnaire produces similar results under consistent conditions. And there are a few ways to assess reliability. There's internal consistency. So are items that measure the same concept, like giving similar responses? And this is often there's the Chromback alpha. There's statistical testing you can do for this stuff. Okay, there's actually books that are literally on how to just test your instruments. So I'm not the expert there at the moment, but I can point you to sources. So internal consistency, if I'm asking multiple questions about language anxiety, are they giving, because the concept's the same with these questions, am I getting similar responses? Test and retest reliability. So if the same participants took the questionnaire again at two different points in time, do their responses remain stable? And then there's the inter-rater reliability. This is relevant if responses are coded by humans, right, manually. And this, for many of you, I think, well, at least my experience is a lot of people who are doing with their dissertation work at least do the inter-rater reliability at some point with their work, especially if there's that qualitative component. So in practice, designing like questionnaires with validity and reliability involves several steps. Careful item design, right? So clear, unambiguous questions that directly reflect your research concept. Obviously, other steps would include piloting, like we've talked about. So trying the questionnaire with a small group to identify like confusing questions or other issues or inconsistencies. Um, used the other tip would be to use established measures when possible. So if you are not, what's there? If there's a valid questionnaire that already exists on the phenomena you're looking at, maybe you can adapt that, and that's going to increase your own validity and reliability, right? Obviously, the final step with this is statistical checks. So after collecting your data, you can compute like that internal consistency and look for like anomalies in those responses. So the validity ensures we are measuring the right thing, and the reliability ensures we measure it consistently. And both of these are really crucial to make your questionnaire data more credible and useful. And also, if you go through these steps the right way, you may be devising an instrument, a tool, a questionnaire, right, that other researchers can then use. So we don't want to ignore this. Um, we're going to talk about two more things and then I'll wrap up. Or one more thing really broadly is challenging with participants. So we talked about administering the survey earlier. Obviously, after you do things like assembling the questionnaire and piloting it, then you are going to administer it. So imagine that you've done that, right? We've administered the survey, and now we got to look at some of the challenges we're going to face with now that that survey is out there in the wild. And one of the first challenges researchers face is that participants may not complete it, right? And there's several reasons why there's these non-responses. One, some invited participants like may like refuse to take part in the study, right? Maybe they don't like the topic. Maybe they're not survey people. Right? I can think of lots of people like that. Others may like start the questionnaire but not finish it, and it's going to result obviously in incomplete data. So, talking about methodology, you're going to have to decide, am I using the incomplete data I got, or am I kicking those out? And that's not going to be a part of my data set, right? There's lots of choices to make along the way with that. Um, Other issues you might have are participants may only give partial response to certain questions or skip some questions altogether, which can affect obviously your data quality because it's incomplete. So when we talk about the quality of the responses provided, that's another issue too. So you may not get good quality responses when they're open-ended questions. And this problem is especially common when the researcher is not not present during the data collection. Without the researcher there, participants, they're not necessarily encouraged to elaborate on their answers, and questions can't be explained or restated in a way that will help the participants understand them if they're misunderstanding them. So two things to consider that might help with some of these issues or other issues that it even mentioned. But I mean, this is just a real issue, right? And you really this is likely going to happen with people that are completing your questionnaire. There's no way around it. Something to think about when you design your actual questionnaire, when you're assembling it, and whether it's through, Qualtrics or Google, obviously as students in this program, you're going to use Qualtrics for your questionnaire. We're probably not going to use Google Forms or anything like that. But is that whether or not you want to use forced response, right? So you're forcing them to have, there's that red asterisk that basically means you have to answer this question. You cannot move on. And this obviously can improve the likelihood of them completing every question, but it also runs the risk of frustrating participants. Or maybe they don't, if they don't care, if there's no agency and buy-in, that's another issue, right? But forced response can at least help that those who are really interested don't overlook a question, and that you're getting every question addressed. It also can be helpful to include attention checkers. So let's say your questionnaire, maybe it's quite long, maybe it's quite monotonous. I had a questionnaire that was like a lot of multiple choice or matching images, and there was a ton of that, and it definitely took like 16-17 minutes. I think it was a pretty long survey. But at some point there was the chance that the participants just zoned out, right? They're just clicking. And especially because we actually paid the individuals to complete the survey, we wanted to ensure that there were accurate responses and that they were thinking they were being genuine, that they were engaged in the survey. So in the middle of the survey, you can add something like a question that's designed to make sure the participant is reading the instructions carefully and still, engaged. Obviously, this is going to improve your data quality. So something like literally the question in the middle of the survey can be something like, to show you are paying attention, please select strongly agree for this item. Right. And so if they're really reading it, then they know what answer to select. And what helps with that is, after we had collected the hundreds of responses we had collected, anybody who answered that question wrong, we just threw out of the data set because they weren't there, right? They weren't engaged with the survey. So let's just end on this. I have several articles too. So when I email out this video to the lab or to the listserv, I will also include the multiple articles I looked at to help compile this. But there are 3 books for sure that I would encourage you to check out. The first one, Questionnaires in Second Language Research, I believe he's got a 2007 edition, a 3rd edition out. I couldn't, the reason I provide the 2003 edition here is because that one you can actually access as an ebook through our university library. And it also has a hard copy in the library. So that one's easy access. I could not find the 2007 one on the online university library system. And there's a couple other books you should definitely check out there. But let's go ahead and stop because we got 10, 12 minutes to see what kind of questions you guys have.